In this tutorial, we're going to be focusing on paint defects, and in specific paint defects that you will come across as a detailer, and what to do, how to address them, and most importantly, when to walk away. Before we get stuck and talk about the paint defects themselves, however, for our YouTube viewers, welcome. We do have a comprehensive detailing training academy on our Teachable platform that you will find the link to in the description of this video. For everybody else, welcome back to another tutorial. Now let's talk about the defects themselves. Please note that many of these defects are going to be covered in more depth in the paint correction tutorial, but as part of every inspection you do for every single car, it is your responsibility and your job to identify the challenges that you might be facing and dealing with. Some of these defects might be very easy to see, they might be very easy to fix. Some of them might be much harder to identify, and some of them you cannot even fix if you tried. It needs a body shop or a respray. I do have a cheat sheet that's going to be uploaded in the Teachable course with the defect, how to resolve it, and tips and tricks. But for everybody else, let's dive into the list and let's try to talk about the most common types of defects that you're going to see as a detailer. In no particular order, the first defect that you will probably come across, and I have one right next to me on this Ford Falcon, is paint fade. Now, paint fade can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused by the paint itself failing. It could be caused by the paint oxidizing if it's single stage and going chalky. And it could actually be caused by lack of paint, and the paint has gone so thin, it's actually showing the primer or the substrate. So the most important thing to identify with paint fade is use your paint thickness gauge, and that will give you a clear idea of what you're dealing with. If you can see that there is enough paint to work with, you might be dealing with oxidation. If the car has a clear coat, it might be an indication that this paint is going to fail even worse in the future. But many commercial vehicles that are white go chalky, and that is nothing to be worried about. It is something that you can simply polish off. And even things like red Ferraris, some classic Japanese and European cars in red, yellow and white tend to have solid colors without a clear coat, and they do go oxidized and chalky over time, and you can bring them up beautifully with paint correction. The next defect that you will see very common is swirl marks. It is the bread and butter of the detailer. It is what we love to deal with paint correction, and those are micro scratches that are caused by minor abrasion. When you don't wash the car properly, when you don't dry it properly, when you rub dirt on it, you will start getting some micro scratches, and over time those micro scratches will look like swirls, will look like circles when you point a light at them. It is very common to find these on both new and used vehicles, and we will be focusing heavily on the paint correction course and dealing with swirl marks. Taking it up a notch from a swirl mark is where you have your deep scratches. Everybody knows what a scratch is. It is basically when something has damaged the paint through the clear coat, through the color, and sometimes right through to the metal. And unfortunately, depending on the depth of the scratch, sometimes you cannot fix this. Again, you need to refer back to your paint thickness gauge, and you can actually feel the scratches. A little bit of a pro tip: if you can feel the scratch with your fingernail, it's probably too deep to fix. Obviously, you need to factor in the thickness of the paint, because if you're dealing with incredibly thick paint, you might be able to fix it with some wet sanding, but that will have its own dedicated training module. In line with swirl marks and scratches, you have what we call buffer haze or holograms. These are still scratches, but these scratches are caused by somebody trying to polish the car incorrectly. It's normally caused by rotary machines, aggressive pads, dirty pads, and so on. And it's very easy to identify these because you normally see it in the pattern that the car was polished in, and very apparent in the sun or with a LED light. All you need to do to get rid of them is go with a medium combination of pad and product, or even a finishing pad and product. Very easy to deal with, but unfortunately very common from hand car wash cafes, car dealerships, and lesser trained detailers, unlike yourselves, because you are training yourself by watching these tutorials. Moving away from something that is easy to fix and to something that we cannot fix is clear coat failure. This is when your clear coat starts peeling and starts cracking Sometimes you're pressure washing the car too close and the paint starts ripping off. All of that stuff is called clear coat failure, if it is the clear coat, not just the paint. And unfortunately, you cannot fix this. Some people say, oh, just go and wet sand it and do this and do that. Unfortunately, in terms of professional detailing, the only repair for this is a respray. And you need to be super careful when you're dealing with cracking and peeling paint, because if you get some of that cracking and peeling paint in your pad, you will cause your own holograms and buffer haze, and you will scratch up the whole car. So be very wary of that kind of defect. Another defect that we cannot fix is rust. Some rust is very obvious when, cars that are very, very old and rusting away. You can see that it's brown or orange and starting to show through the color. However, sometimes it's not as obvious. It will look like a bubble underneath the paint, and it will only get bigger or worse. Just like the failing clear coat, you need to be careful not to get that stuck into your polishing pad, because you will cause more damage. And we do have some rust in the car beside me that we will go through at a later video with the inspection for the Ford Falcon GT that's beside me. But that is rust. Unfortunately, you cannot fix that. Do not, however, confuse it with iron fallout, which is metal shavings and metal particles from the atmosphere or the environment that have adhered to the paint. That kind of defect you can fix, because that metal is on the surface and you can, generally speaking, remove it with clay barring or with iron fallout removers when you spray the car and it turns purple and starts dissolving the iron. Very easy to deal with that one, but proper rust is very hard to deal with. Bird poo and bat poo. This is going to be something you come across a lot as a detailer, even on some brand new cars. And this needs a lot of common sense and a touch of finesse to deal with. The first thing you need to do is have a look at that defect. And if it is just a stain, generally speaking, you could either polish it out, compound it out, or even use a little bit of wet sanding. But if that acid from the bird poo or bat poo has etched so deep into the clear coat that it's starting to crack the clear coat, generally speaking, you will need to fix that with a respray. The only way you're going to be able to see how far you can get with the fix is by giving it a try. And that's where you need to have your paint thickness gauge, and you need to make sure to pick a starting point. So let's say you're dealing with 110 microns thick paint, and start polishing away, and be very careful not to go through the clear coat trying to chase something that's not going to be resolved. You might be able to make it better, but by trying to make it perfect, you might actually damage the paint yourself. So that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but you will have to treat every single stain as an individual case. There is no one fix for all in this matter, unfortunately. The same thing can be said for tree sap marks. So they will look like little spots, and that is where tree sap sat onto the paint and started to chemically react with the paint. Generally speaking, you can polish them off. We do have a training module dedicated for water spotting, and we talk about chemical etching there. So I'm not going to dive too much into the chemical etching side of things, but you can probably polish off tree sap marks. If they are too deep, you might have to wet sand them off, but if they have gone through the clear completely, again, your only option will be a respray. Clear coat burn through. This is unfortunately something that is caused by people, and it is when you have a rotary machine or you have a DA and you go too aggressive, and what ends up happening is you will start having a dull patch on the paint. So you're looking at the paint that's nice and shiny, and there's one area that doesn't look as shiny. The best way to inspect that kind of defect is with a paint thickness gauge. So if you're scanning the paint and it's around 100 microns everywhere that's nice and shiny and bright, and it's around 70 or 60 microns or 50 microns or something very different where that dull patch is, you can bet $1 that that is paint that has been burnt through. Do not go over it with a polishing machine, because guess what's going to happen? It's only going to get worse and bigger, because you're removing more paint, you're not adding paint. It's also very important that when you're doing paint correction, every time you work on a panel, you have a very good look at it before you start, then you have a very good look at it as you're working on it. Because if you're going over it and then you're realizing it's dulling out, stop, wipe, and have a look, because you might have started burning through that paint And the more you keep going, thinking you're going to try to fix that patch, the bigger that patch is going to get. Finally, and we touched on it a little bit, is water spotting. So at this point when you're inspecting, you don't know if it's a mineral deposit or chemical etching. All you could see is blotch marks in the shape of liquid. So for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to call it all as water spots. It might be etching, it might be a deposit. We have a dedicated video for this aspect and this subject, which is very, very important because you're going to be coming across this very, very, very frequently, especially with new cars. So mineral deposits and water spots is a very common defect. Now we're going to be talking about actual paint defects. I'm not a spray painter. I'm not going to try to teach you how to become a spray painter. And I'm sure there's a lot of information online about defects that are caused by improper painting procedures and faulty paint. But it's important to identify them because you need to make sure you can either work around them, try to fix them, or walk away from them. Things that you're going to come across very commonly is paint runs. That is when basically the spray painter has started spraying and the paint is starting to sag and run down, whether it's a drip or a line. That's something that needs to be wet sanded out if the paint is thick enough. Normally when I get a case like this, I just say to the owner of the vehicle, if it has been freshly painted, to go back to the painter, because it is the painter's responsibility to resolve this. And because they are a paint shop and they were the paint shop that painted that car, if they burn through the paint trying to fix it, they can just respray it because they should have the color, they should have the skills, you'd hope so. On the opposite side of a paint run, you have the paint sagging. And that is when you have a low area, a low spot where it's sort of sunk in. Again, the best way to fix that will be wet sanding, depending on how thick the paint is. Another defect from factory that I have seen even with OEM vehicles, and Renault are notorious for this. I don't know the exact terminology they use, but it's inconsistent density of the metallic flakes in spray paint. So you might look at the car in a specific angle and you tend to get that with the Renault Formula One orange on the Clio and the Megane. And it looks like the bonnet or the panel is patchy. And when you look closer at it, you can't really explain why it's patchy. But after having a lot of investigation and talking to spray painters, it's actually the density of the metallic flakes in the paint were not spread out evenly. So you might have an area with more metallic than the rest of the panel, which looks like, which will give it I guess, kind of the look that it has a patch. So that is an OEM defect, and I've seen it with white and with orange. So keep that in mind. I'm sure other manufacturers would have this kind of issue, especially in aftermarket spray jobs. So it's not always the physical paint layer itself. It might just be the way it was mixed or sprayed. The next two are very, very common, and that is sanding marks and pigtails. This is where the body shop didn't finish off nice enough before they started spraying, or they sprayed the paint, they found that there is orange peel or texture, and they sanded it out, but they didn't finish it properly, and there's still sanding marks. Or pigtails is when you have you're using a random orbital sander, and as you can see in the photos here, it leaves marks. That is when you're, I guess, running it a bit too dirty or too dry. Again, the best way to fix these is more paint correction or a finer level of sanding. But like everything else, you have to push back to the painter, which leads me to the next point, which is a defect, and that is orange peel. Now, orange peel is an interesting one because as a detailer, you can definitely fix it, and you can fix that by either wet sanding, using a denim pad, or just heavy cutting and polishing. And that orange peel texture is related to the, I guess, the spray painter and how they mixed the paint itself and sprayed it, the technique. But if you get somebody who comes to you with a car that doesn't look as reflective, it might be shiny, but it just doesn't look as clear when you're looking at it like a mirror, it's probably because it has orange peel, and that orange peel can definitely be fixed with the right technique, whether it's wet sanding or compounding. and it is something we'll be talking about in later tutorials. And finally, a defect that we can't really do much about ourselves is blend lines. This is when somebody has an accident, paint the recorder, and they blend it in with the door, or they blend it in with the pillar or the roof. And unfortunately, that area where the new paint meets the old paint, under specific lighting, you can actually see the two different colors. You have to be careful when you're polishing that area, not to go too hard because you might make it worse. You're removing that blended paint. So be very careful with blend marks, but goes back to the importance of having a paint thickness gauge, because when you're inspecting the car with the paint thickness gauge, you'll be able to clearly see that this panel was painted, this panel is original, and you can expect a blend line somewhere there if the job wasn't done properly. But the key thing to take out of all of this is to have a paint thickness gauge. You cannot be adventurous as a detailer or try to repair something without a paint thickness gauge, no matter how skilled you are. If you are the best detailer in the world, you cannot go and wet sand a run without having a paint thickness gauge. You can definitely have a very educated guess and have a great chance of not having an issue, but you're still only guessing and assuming. Paint thickness gauge is a must-have for every detailer, and our next tutorial is going to be about inspecting the vehicles before the detailing and using that paint thickness gauge. So for everybody, thank you for watching again. I hope you have found value in this tutorial. Like I said, I will have a cheat sheet uploaded for everybody on our Teachable course. For everybody else on our YouTube channel, please subscribe, please like, and please check out our training courses, because you're going to find many more tutorials that will save you a lot of time and money. Thank you for watching.